Hey there, wake up. It's Means Morning News. Just after 11 a.m. on the East Coast in Washington, D.C., and this is that source for anti capitalist news and analysis. And I'm that host, Sam Sachs. Good morning to everyone, especially California Bay Area landlord Jingyu Wu. He owns an apartment building in San Leandro, and he's on a hunger strike to protest the city's eviction moratorium. He's been demonstrating outside the Alameda County Administration Building in Oakland, and one of his signs reads, quote, "Hunger strike until I die." Finally, a landlord doing something we can all rally behind. Let's hope he sees this out to the end. And we begin with the unelected conservative majority on the United States Supreme Court, which looks poised to kill off President Biden's student loan relief proposal. Upwards of 40 million people stand to benefit from having their loan debt reduced, and in the case of about 20 million people, that debt would be completely eliminated. That is, unless the High Court strikes it all down. During oral arguments on Tuesday, right wing justices appeared skeptical of the administration's claims that the 2003 law known as the HEROES Act gives the Department of Education broad authority to modify student loan obligations during a national emergency, in this case, the COVID-19 pandemic. The Trump administration Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos, used the exact same authority to institute a repayment freeze on all student loans during the pandemic. That freeze is still in place. The Biden White House went a step further and reduced the debt obligations for individuals holding federal student loans. The challenge to the relief program was brought by 6 states led by Republican attorneys general. It's not exactly clear how these states have standing to sue. Missouri claims that the Biden administration's actions harm the state's higher education loan authority, which administers loans to students in the state and would be deprived of revenue if some of those loans are canceled. There's a separate challenge brought by individuals who claim they are being treated unfairly because they took out private student loans and are not eligible for forgiveness. That lawsuit is backed by a number of conservative advocacy groups. Lawyers for the administration argued that Congress gave the Education Department power to cancel these loans when it passed the HEROES Act 20 years ago. But right wing justices argued that the scope of the program, which would affect tens of millions of people, and the cost of the program, about $400 billion, necessitates Congress to explicitly authorize it. The conservative court pushed the made up major questions doctrine, which stipulates that federal agencies don't have any power beyond what Congress explicitly gives them. The court has previously used the theory to justify limiting the EPA's power to enforce environmental regulations to curb global warming. No reason, though, getting too focused on the legal theories presented by the court's conservative bloc, since they're ultimately just playing Calvin ball here. They start with the ruling they want to issue and work backwards from there, concocting a legal theory to support it. At one point during the hearing, Chief Justice John Roberts rejected the administration's claim that it was modifying student loans. Roberts said that Biden modified loans in the same way that the French Revolution modified the French nobility. Some of you might think that this is a weird argument. I mean, in this country, you're taught in school that we're better than European countries because we don't tolerate monarchy, aristocracy, or nobility. But in reality, this country has always been ruled by unelected rich people with power until they die, the Supreme Court. So it's unsurprising seeing Roberts take the side of the Bourbon dynasty. Anyway, let the Supreme Court do their thing here. It won't change the fact that ultimately tens of millions of people will simply not pay back their student loans anymore. The Wall Street Journal published an exclusive over the weekend that suggested the COVID pandemic may have originated in a Chinese research center. It's based on a new assessment by the Department of Energy that concluded the virus most likely came from a laboratory mishap in the city of Wuhan, China. Sources told the journal that the department updated its findings based on new classified evidence. It didn't release the evidence. Also, whatever that evidence was isn't a slam dunk because ultimately the assessment is described as, quote, low confidence. Meanwhile, the majority of virologists who've investigated this still believe COVID came from a seafood market in Wuhan, and they've actually stacked up evidence to support that conclusion. One of the most exhaustive scientific studies on the COVID origin was published in the journal Science last summer. Reading from that report, quote, we show here that the earliest known COVID 19 cases from December 2019, including those without reported direct links, were geographically centered on this market. We report that live SARS CoV 2 susceptible mammals were sold at the market in late 2019, and that within the market, SARS CoV 2 positive environmental samples were spatially associated with vendors selling live animals. The report detailed how COVID positive samples were taken from specific locations in the market, including in cages selling live animals, and it disputed the claim that the market was merely a super spreader event by noting how several other shopping centers and places of gatherings in the Wuhan area had far more civilian traffic, yet cases were still concentrated in the seafood market. Meanwhile, lab leak boosters have close to zero scientific evidence on their side. In fact, the only evidence they have is a circumstantial claim of, hey, isn't it weird there was a virus research facility in Wuhan where the initial outbreak occurred? What they don't mention is that there are similar facilities all over China and that Wuhan is a major city with a population of 11 million people. And so far, there has been no evidence that the lab was engaged in work that could lead to a leak in the spread of COVID 19. Following the Wall Street Journal's report, one of the authors of the research published in Science, Dr. Angela Rasmussen, reminded everyone on Twitter that based on the publicly available evidence, there is no indication the Wuhan Center for Disease Control was keeping live bats, no indication of a lab accident there, no indication of infected staff, no indication of virus culture at the facility, and no indication of SARS CoV 2 or a progenitor virus at the lab. Also worth noting that most government agencies also conclude that the virus came from natural transmission. Only the Department of Energy and the FBI have determined it was a lab leak, and the Bureau rated its conclusion with just medium confidence. And you have to question what exactly the FBI is up to here, given that its director, Christopher Wray, just gave an exclusive interview to Fox News and went beyond lab leak and speculated that it may have been a bioweapon.
The FBI has folks, agents, professionals, analysts, virologists, microbiologists, et cetera, who focus specifically on the dangers of biological threats, which include things like novel viruses like COVID, and the concerns that in the wrong hands, some bad guys, a hostile nation state, a terrorist, a criminal, the threats that those could pose. So here you're talking about a potential leak from a Chinese government-controlled lab that killed millions of Americans, and that's precisely what that capability was designed for.
Oh, for sure, for sure. You know, it's hard not to view this latest push for lab leak in the broader context of U.S. policymakers pushing for more confrontation with China. The Department of Energy's reassessment comes just as tensions are heightened following the Chinese weather balloon fiasco, and as the Biden administration ramps up its economic warfare campaign against Beijing. It also coincided with Congress hosting a primetime hearing on Tuesday night to discuss the threats posed by China. During it, the committee's chairman, Mike Gallagher, discussed a clash of civilizations.
As we investigate and expose the ideological, technological, economic, and military threat posed by the Chinese Communist Party, we may call this a strategic competition, but it's not a polite tennis match. This is an existential struggle over what life will look like in the 21st century. And the most fundamental freedoms are at stake. The CCP is laser focused on its vision for the future, a world crowded with techno-totalitarian surveillance states where human rights are subordinate to the whims of the party. For the time being, it's still up to us to decide if that's the future we want for our children, but it won't be for much longer. Time is not on our side.
Okay, relax, dude. I would recommend that everyone paying attention to this story, especially the lab leak heads out there, consider whether they are actually engaged in a good faith inquiry here, or if they're just suckers being led by neocons who are trying to set the US up for its next great war. Disturbing scenes from the occupied Palestinian territories over the weekend, where upwards of 400 Israeli settlers went on a rampage through towns just outside of Nablus. They shot at Palestinians, beat them, set more than 100 cars on fire, and burned down dozens of homes. One Palestinian was reportedly killed, nearly 400 were injured. The riot was in response to a Palestinian resistance attack in the town of Huwara that killed 2 Israeli settlers, which was in response to a raid by Israeli forces in Nablus last month that killed 11 Palestinians and injured more than 100 others. The Netanyahu government attempted to distance itself from the pogrom and claimed it did not support citizens taking the law into their own hands. Mondo Weiss reported, however, that, quote, the Israeli army accompanied the settlers as they were out for blood, ensuring their safety and freedom to lynch and burn as they pleased. And even if the IDF wasn't leading this assault, the apartheid government created the conditions for it, and based on its actions afterward, condoned it. Only 8 Israeli settlers were arrested for the mass violence, and every single one of them has since been released, which is to be expected because when Israelis take the law into their own hands against Palestinians, they are rarely punished for it. Only 3% of investigations into attacks against Palestinians led to a conviction, and 93% of investigations closed without even an indictment. That's according to the Israeli rights group Yesh Din. That's a message from the apartheid government to its preferred citizens that it needs their help to enforce this deeply unjust system. Following the riot, Israel's far-right, racist security minister Itamar Ben-Gvir rallied settlers at a different illegal outpost in the West Bank, where he vowed that the Israeli state would, quote, crush enemies. And a lawmaker in the Netanyahu governing coalition, Zvi Fogel, said he approved of the pogrom against the Palestinian people. He described it as a, quote, act of deterrence. Meanwhile, the U.S. State Department has signaled no change in support for the apartheid government and its security forces. The story we've now long been following is how the pandemic raised class consciousness among workers in the U.S. and resulted in a wave of strikes and union organizing. Well, in response, Capital dusted off an old tool to break surging worker power, and that's child labor. The number of violations related to minors working unlawfully at U.S. businesses increased by 37% during 2022. Investigators found over 3,800 kids working in violation of child labor laws, and since 2018, there's been a 69% increase in children illegally working. That's according to the Department of Labor, and it's not nice. One of the more egregious examples of this was discovered just last month when the department found that Packer Sanitation Services, one of the largest food safety sanitation companies in the country, illegally employed more than 100 kids at dangerous meat processing facilities around the country, some of them as young as 13. They were found to be cleaning hazardous equipment and working overnight shifts at 13 facilities across 8 states. Last December, McDonald's franchise owners at 13 locations were also found to be in violation of child labor laws. Over 100 minors involved in that case, too, with some of them assigned to dangerous jobs like operating the deep fryer and working more hours than they're supposed to during a school day. And a recent New York Times investigation found that capitalists are pulling their child labor from the ranks of the undocumented, A surge of unaccompanied minors coming across the southern border, separated from their parents, have been forced into jobs doing dangerous work for long hours. Reading from the Times piece, quote, in Los Angeles, children stitch Made in America tags into J. Crew shirts. They bake dinner rolls sold at Walmart and Target, process milk used in Ben and Jerry's ice cream, and help debone chicken sold at Whole Foods. As recently as the fall, middle schoolers made Fruit of the Loom socks in Alabama, and in Michigan, children make auto parts used by Ford and General Motors. Caseworkers told the paper that they believe as many as 2/3 of undocumented migrants that arrive in the U.S. end up being forced into working full time. The Department of Labor is now trying to crack down on this problem. On Monday, it announced it would increase scrutiny of industries where child labor is most likely to occur, and it would reform how it vets sponsors of undocumented child migrants and provide better assistance to kids after they arrive to shield them from exploitation. The department also called on Congress to increase funding for its enforcement agencies and to increase the fines associated with child labor violations. Currently, the max fine is only about $15,000 per child, which is why Packer Sanitation Services was hit with a measly $1.5 million penalty despite employing over 100 kids illegally. At the same time, however, Capitol is pushing state lawmakers to relax regulations on child labor. Last year, New Jersey passed a law that increased the number of hours that children can work. In Minnesota, lawmakers are considering a bill to allow 16 and 17-year-olds to work dangerous construction jobs. And in Iowa, a bill was introduced that would also broaden the type of work minors can do. The legislation also shields employers from lawsuits if kids get injured or die on the job in certain circumstances. Capitol wants to party like it's 1909. All right, friends, the show ends this morning with a sunrise from California. It's actually a photo of a sunrise and was sent in by Noah in Los Angeles. Enjoy. Thank you, Noah. That's it for the show. Thanks for watching. Thanks to the team behind the scenes. Please subscribe to our YouTube and podcast channels if you haven't already. One day, capitalism will fall. Until then, we're going to be right here. See you tomorrow.